Lynette, we are ready to proceed and we're ready to go. It looks like we are live, but yeah, so we do have a quorum. So go ahead, please.
Great.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, would you take roll call, please?
Thank you. Good morning. Director Desmond?
Here.
Jones?
Here.
Nisley? Absent McCully?
Here.
Saragosa?
Here.
Schaefer?
Here.
Soon?
Here.
Thomas? Absent Vega?
Here.
Vice Chair Dowden Calvillo? Absent and Chair Gallardo.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we will watch, I believe that I had Director Thomas going to be remote, but I don't see her on there, so I'll see if she pops up. We'll add her in.
Sure, and I'll make sure to let you know if she is added to the meeting.
Thank you. Then we'll change our voting. So thank you. Our next item on the agenda is public communications. This is an opportunity for anyone from the public that would like to comment on any item that is not on our agenda. Eric, do we have any speaker cards?
There are no speaker cards and no members of the public
Okay.
to speak.
Thank you. Well, we'll move on. Our next item then is going to be a reminder on our disclosure. I know we see this on our agenda now, but just if there's any item that you have a conflict of interest under state law or any item that you would like to be recused from, just a reminder that that is there. And then we will move on to our consent calendar. We have 2 items on consent, and with no public comment or no public, then I will look for a motion for the consent calendar.
Move consent.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Moved and seconded, and we can do just a regular vote, no roll call needed. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. All right, we're going to move on to our first action item, and Loretta Sue is going to be speaking to us this morning about the amendments to the budget.
Good morning. Thank you. So this item is seeking board approval to approve the amendment number 1 to the budget and OWP for fiscal year 2024-25 and authorize staff to submit the required documentations to Caltrans and the funding agency. SACOG, as required by the federal regulation and mandates, has to prepare and submit the board-adopted budget and overall work program, also known as OWP, for the fiscal year 2024-25 to Caltrans and Federal Funding Agency in May 2024. The OWP includes projects and activity that support SACOG region in implementing the blueprint projects and also SACOG core planning activities. Because the adopted budget was prepared prior to the closing of the prior fiscal year, so it does not include all the actual carryover for some of the multi-year grants and programs. So included in this amendment number 1 to the budget and OWP for fiscal year 2024-25 includes carryover adjustment, approved ICAP rates, and also staff hour reallocations. So included in the amendment number 1 is adjustment to the carryovers on multiples year grants and award, which resulted in a net increase of 1.7 million comparing to the adopted budget. This includes past due funds from the Cal ITP for the transit operator for purchase of the contactless fare payment systems, and then also past due REAP 1 housing and REAP 2 Green Means Go funds for member jurisdictions. And then also carry over for SACOG regional planning, programming, and monitoring fees. The amendment also reflected the FTA approved indirect cost plan allocation rates, which is slightly a little bit higher than what is included in the adopted budgets. And then lastly, the amendment also reflects reallocation of hours, staff hours based on expected utilization for the next couple months, and also due to the adjustment to the carryover, as I noted earlier. So the amendment number 1 to the budget and OWP for fiscal year 24-25 reflects a total revenue of approximately 37.5 million, and including the use of reserve or restricted fund of approximately 4.6 million and undesignated fund balance of 900,000 to cover total expenditures of 42.9 million, which is an increase of approximately 1.7 million, as I noted earlier, and it's a 4% increase comparing to the adopted budget. So some of the schedule that are also included in the staff item include attachment A, which shows the changes in the overall revenue by funding source. Attachment B through attachment E provide a summary of revenue and expenditures included in the amendment number 1 to the fiscal year 24-25 budget and OWP. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for the presentations. Any questions on this item?
Madam Chair,
Yes,
I have
please.
a question. Thank you, Loretta. I just had a question. I know we're using some reserve funds, so I was just wondering what does that take us down to in terms of our reserves? I mean, are we still in a healthy reserve situation?
Yes, so basically included in the amendment budget is approximately 4.6 million of restricted reserve funds. So those included the payment that we received from Strategic Growth Council for the Green Bean School that was recorded as revenue last fiscal year. So, but we had not incurred or the member jurisdiction have not billed us on the expenditure yet. So that is part of that amount that you're seeing there. And then included also the board approved use of the fund balance of 900,000. So that did not change from the original budget. So later today, when I'm doing the forecast, I'll go into a little bit more about the fund balance. So yes, at this point, our fund balance reserve is still pretty healthy.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank you. Appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Great question. So we don't roll over in that line item, then you just held it and we're expending it this year.
That's correct, yes. Mhm.
Any other questions? All right. Is there any public comment on this item?
There's no public comment.
All right. We'll see none, then I will bring it back for action to this committee.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Thank you. Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Aye. Motion carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next presenter will be Clint Holtzen, and we will be talking about the Sustainable Communities Strategy Adoption Schedule and State Policies. Good morning.
Good morning. I will be pretty brief. This is coming back to you on our continuing the conversation about AB 350, which will sunset on us after we adopt this plan, this 2025 blueprint at the end of next year, which means that our next plan currently is due in 2027. So the decision facing the board is, do we go ahead and do that, do a very light update in 2027, and in the meantime, work with our partners, our other MPOs, state partners, on addressing some of the SB1 eligibility issues so that we can, because a 2027 plan is most likely going to be not hitting a greenhouse gas target, needing to go with an alternative planning strategy. We would work in the meantime on trying to make sure that this region didn't lose eligibility to state funding programs. The other option is that we go back and revisit AB 350 next year, work on legislation to get the date made permanent and push it out to 2029. We only have time to do one of those things, either work on legislation to push it out to 2029 or work on legislation that addresses the eligibility issues or work with partners on the eligibility issues. Because we can only do one of those things, the decision's in front of you all. When we talked at the Strategic Planning Committee in August, the committees in September, and the board had a good discussion. Option 1, which was a light update in 2027, working on the SB1 eligibility issues, and then having that be the permanent schedule going forward, so 27, 31 going forward. That was kind of where the board conversation revolved. And so coming back to this committee, that is the staff recommendation in front of you to go with that, to get your recommendation for the board, but then also answer any final questions or further discussion that you might want to have. So that's all I've got for my presentation, and then turn it over to you all.
Well, thank you. I think we've all been through several opportunities to look at this and have, but I will open it up for questions. Okay.
Thank you for all your work on this, and really appreciate it, and appreciate all the discussion we've had. I'll move staff recommendation.
Thank you. Thank you. Before we take a vote on this, I will open, any other questions or comments? Any public comment on this item?
There's no public comment on this item.
All right, thank you. Please.
Chair, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I understand correctly. So I was very brief.
Mike, please.
Thank you. I wasn't able to be part of the strategic planning session, so I just want to understand. So this would go to make the AB 350, making that schedule permanent. So we are a light update in 2027, but we're going to continue with the off schedule.
So the option would be, the option that is the staff recommendation.
Yeah.
Is to go back to our old schedule. So 2027 light update,
A light
and then every 4 years after that. So we wouldn't adopt again until 2031, 35, 39, and so on.
But then we're gonna go out for our partners to,
Yeah, so if it's very likely that our next plan, whether it's 27 or 29, would go with an alternative planning scenario, because hitting the greenhouse gas target is going to be extremely challenging. That will happen either in 27 or 29. The recommendation is to go ahead and let that happen in 27, do a light update, most likely in APS, but we would work on with partners on SB1, which is the law that would,
eligibility.
yeah,
Yes.
remove our eligibility for
Yeah.
some of the grant programs.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. I just want to make sure I heard that correct.
Yeah.
So just for clarification as well, sorry, Chair.
No, please.
Option 2 was something that we'd be kind of going at it on our own if we chose to do that.
Yes.
This way, we have the ability to work with other organizations similar to ours that we could partner with, because, we don't really want to take this on all by ourselves.
I think that's fair.
We're all in the same boat. So, yeah,
Yes,
agreed.
absolutely. We're all going to be meeting those challenges.
Yeah.
However they come.
And Director Schaefer, there was a bit of conversation at your September Policy Innovation Committee about, where are the partners in all of this, and, how is that going? So in your packet, you will see an attachment as a letter from the 4 largest MPOs that we've signed on to with the Bay Area, LA, and San Diego. That came, I think, just after the policy committee met last month. Just giving you a sense of, this will not be easy, but we are in partnership with our other, peer agencies, and it will take more than that too. I would also tell you, it will take a lot of your time, and we're going to be coming back to you next year and the following year, possibly through CalCog, possibly through your other. The good news is this is a statewide effort. The challenge is it's going to be a huge lift, right? So.
Yeah, I think as we went through all this, the downsides, because we talked about, what could be, is you kind of end up in the same place, but under this scenario, we end up having some more partners with us in this fight. Because we probably end up in an AWS situation regardless, or APS, excuse me, the alternative scenario. But at least in this case, it gives us a little bit better chance, I think, as we go to the legislature and try to make some, lasting corrections. So I do think this is the right course for us to take.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate the input. Like I say, we've looked at this multiple times, and I think it really was a process that's been really well researched, and we've come to the same, there's risks and there's some challenges and all the options. There wasn't the obvious answer, but I think this is the answer that works as we work with our partners and gives us the best option moving forward. So happy to see that we got to this point. With that, I believe it was Director Desmond, it was our Moved and second. So with that and no public comment, I will take a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. All right, our next item is our information item, and we will be back with Ms. Loretta Sue again and talk about our 5-year budget forecast.
Yes, okay. I'm gonna tee this up a little bit just for this discussion. I think we had, well, like I made mention of this last month at your Policy and Innovation Committee. So we want to get in this morning to just giving you a little bit of a sense of what, I mean, I appreciate Director Saragosa, your question, right, about reserve balances, reserve funds, right? Like basically, what's the financial health of the agency, of this organization? What does it look like going forward? How are we doing now? What challenges do we see coming? I want to give Loretta a lot of credit, as I often do, but we've never done this before. So this is the first time we'll have come to all of you and really trying to give you some sense of where we're heading, give you some sense of what our financial health looks like over 5 years. And the thing I will tell you, and I think Laura's done a lot of great work to try to sort of smooth out, if you will, what the next 5 years look like. In some ways, our revenues, there's certain portions of our revenues that are predictable, and in other ways, it's incredibly unpredictable and hard to estimate. And we're not exactly like a local government, like all of your cities and counties that you sit on. The next 2 years look, we have a sort of an insight into that. And as you'll see in some of these numbers, the good news is we've managed to bring in a lot of revenues through a lot of grants that have actually helped a lot of our work and a lot of your local government. You'll see that as some of the larger numbers in the next 2 fiscal years. It's hard to predict again what happens after that. So it's very hard to predict years 3, 4, and 5. But one thing I will say, not to bury the headline here, is that I come away with a lot of this work is it's going to be really important that we continue to go out and try to get revenue, try to get grants to support a lot of the programs that are important to implementing our plan, to helping all of you locally. So that's going to be a continued, the HUD grant that we discussed briefly the last month that we're going to be applying for is an example of how we can bring in revenues to help all of you and advance things like Green Means Go and some of our housing efforts. So I hope that's, so take this this is a trial run in some way, right? We've never really done this before, but we want to really invite all of you in to just take a look at what the financial health of the agency looks like, what we know, what we don't know the next 5 years. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you, James, for the tee up of that. As James mentioned, so staff have prepared a 5 years budget forecast, which includes the budget amendment number 1 that you just heard for fiscal year 24-25, and then also 4 years rolling forecast that is due fiscal year 28-29. So the intent of the forecast is to provide a baseline of SACOG expenses and offer some of the insight into what staff notes about SACOG finances over the 0 years. Obviously, there's still got a lot of unknown, but this kind of provides sort of kind of baseline budget for SACOG. Oops. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so today, this morning, staff is going to provide an overview first, just to take a look at some of the historical financial informations. Oops. And then we'll go into the 5-year forecast overview and then talk about some of the potential options that can kind of narrow the budget gap in the later fiscal years. So let's just kind of start off with a little bit about historical information. And I want to provide just a quick overview of where SACOG gets its funding from. So SACOG, as a metropolitan planning organization, receive regional planning, programming, and monitoring fees for the 6 county regions. And SACOG, as a regional transportation planning agency, receive a planning and administrative fees for administering the TDA program for the 4 counties. And then also SACOG as a council of government, obviously receive membership due fees that help supplements the technical support for member jurisdiction, and then also covering the board expenses and peer region tours, and also some of the federal and state advocacy work. And lastly, obviously, there's the discretionary grant buckets. You know, SACOG has been continuing actively pursuing grant opportunity to supplement SACOG operation, but also funding for the regions to implement the SES projects. So this is just kind of an overview of what SACOG typical fund revenue source by category looks like. More than 50% is coming from the federal government, that including all the regional planning and programming and monitoring funds, and then some discretionary funds also. State makes up 15% of the revenue source. Local, mainly the TDA funds, makes up 26%, and then membership dues makes up 5% of the overall SACOG budgets. Now, this is just a quick snapshot of the makeup for fiscal year 24-25, but in any given year, this is kind of like approximate percentage in terms of the type of revenues that are coming into SACOG. So I want to provide a little quick overview of historically what SACOG adopted budget looks like. So from this chart and also the table below, as you can see, over the past couple years, when the board adopts SACOG budgets, always start off with use of fund balance. The reason being that is that when staff preparing the budget, that was early on the fiscal year, where that staff have not closed out the prior fiscal year yet. So there's unknown in terms of the actual carryovers. And then also there could be potential grant application that staff submitted, but was not awarded at the time the budget is adopted, so it's not included in there also. So those are the two main factors that could affect why SACOG start off historically asking the board for approval using the fund balance. And then part of that reason is also there are some carryover expenditures that the board approved from the prior years in terms of using fund balance, but because those expenses did not occur, mainly match for discretionary grants, so that got carried over to the next fiscal year also. Now, so the actual looks a little bit different from what the adopted budget. So this is the actual operating result for the last 5 fiscal year. As you can see from the chart and also from the table below, SACOG has been successful in winning discretionary grants or bringing additional funding source into SACOG revenue bucket. And then also SACOG have been actively managing the expenses also. As a result, it's actually reflected an increase or adding funds to the fund balance instead of using fund balance, as you can see from the previous slide. So over the past 5 years, on average, SACOG has been adding approximately 1 million to 1.5 million in any given fiscal year to the fund balance. Okay, so let's kind of talk a little bit about the 5-year forecast. So what I want to show, this is something that Jim has mentioned to earlier. So, you know, as you can see from this chart here, for fiscal year 24-25 and also next fiscal year, that you see a huge increase in revenue. And these are due to some of the one-time funding, past due funding, that including the REAP 2 Green Means Go funding, also the RCN grant that we just recently got awarded, and then some of the discretionary grants that is including the RACE grant for the mobility zone, and then some of the funding from the SB 125. So that's why you see a huge influx in revenue, but then it's have a huge drop starting in fiscal year 26-27. And the reason is that because those one-time grant is going to be ended by fiscal year 26-27. So that's where that it bring the revenue down to just the normal revenue that SACOG receive, as I mentioned earlier, of the different category of revenue there. Obviously, included in this projection, revenue projection, we did not include any additional discretionary grant award that we potentially will be going after, which James had mentioned a few earlier. So we just want to kind of show like a baseline budget and what that looked like. Okay, kind of going into the expenditures. Again, so we're trying to build a forecast just based on SIGCOG baseline or basic expenditures, that including obviously in the bar chart there that you see that it cover the total expenses for each fiscal year, that including staff costs, consulting costs, small pass-through costs that is related to the TDM program, and then other costs, which is mainly operating costs. And then it go by fiscal year. And then the white line on top is representing revenue that you saw earlier from the earlier slide, except that we took out the pass-through costs and pass-through revenue. So this is sort of kind of baseline operating budget, and then also baseline revenue projected for the next couple of years. And then if you kind of looked out to fiscal year 27, 28, obviously you see that there is a small budget gaps of approximately $1 million, where that basically we have more expenditures than revenue coming in. Obviously that the expenditures that you see that is slightly growing over the next couple of years, that because we do included the COLA increase and any increase in employee benefits that we know of at this point. That is also built into the budget there. And then going into, sorry.
Sorry, I just want, your heads were nodding, but I just wanted to make sure you understood. This is Loretta's work to take out those pass-through costs. So you're kind of looking at sort of its, the smooth line in terms of revenue expenses. Okay, looks like everybody's on the same page.
Okay. Righty. So again, this is sort of kind of like the baseline budget. So what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about, okay, what are we going to do with some of the budget shortfall in our fiscal year 27, 28, 28, 29. So staff have built together a couple of scenarios so we can kind of look at it together and have a discussion on that also. So let me just start off. So Ed noted earlier that, obviously the baseline budget does not include any additional grant awards that potentially SIGCOG might be awarded for, like the pro-housing grant that staff is going to be submitting soon, which is going to be a 1.5 to 2 million approximately. So if we're successful in receiving that funding, that will be spread over the next couple of years also, right? And then there's also opportunity to use some formula funding for program also. Obviously, that will be at discretion of the board. So, sorry, this is a little bit messy here, but just to kind of show visually what that looked like. So what I have here is the baseline budgets, same as what you've seen in the earlier slide, which is in the bar chart. And the first line, which is the purple line, is the baseline revenue, same thing as what you saw in the earlier slide. So then we've kind of built into 3 different scenarios. So the first scenario is the red line, which saying that, okay, let's just add in 1.5 million of discretionary funds starting in fiscal year 25, 26 and forward. And as traditional discretionary grants, it had a couple years life cycle. So we accounted for that for the next couple years. So with 1.5 million coming in, it does not fully cover the shortfall that we have in fiscal year 27, 28, and 28, 29. And then the second scenario that we built in there is that what if there is increase in formula funding? What does it look like if we do have an increase in formula funding? 2 of our national association are advocating for 100% increase in PL funding as part of the reauthorization bill. And then additionally proposing some competitive programs convert to formula program for MPO. So should we're successful in lobbying and receiving the increase in PL funding, obviously that will have a significant positive impact in SIGCOG operations. So for this illustration or scenario purposes, we took a 50% increase of PL funding and see what that looked like. So obviously, as you can see, if we do receive 50% increase in PL funding, which is starting in fiscal year 27-28, that will have enough, more than enough to cover SACOG baseline budget operation, right? And then same thing with fiscal year 28-29.
We just pause on that
Mhm.
for a sec, Loretta. So, and just to dig into this a little bit, because I know there's a lot of information here, and the way in which all this money works, the funding works, is complicated. That won't be any surprise to you, right? So, but remember the pie chart, what I showed you earlier, federal funds are like a majority of a lot of the operating revenue we get. So we're federal MPO, right? We have a lot of federal responsibilities. Those responsibilities have grown over time, but the actual money by which the feds give us to operate has not grown. This sounds like a familiar story, right? You got more things that are required of you and this a stable amount of money to do it. For a while, a lot of our peer agencies around the country have been pushing for more planning funds and pushing for an increase in revenue commensurate with all the things we have to do. It's never really panned out. So there is, I think, a little bit of a coming together now for the federal transportation reauthorization bill, which has to get redone ostensibly by the FY26, end of FY26, to increase some of that funding. And that's what Loretta's giving you in the orange line, is that right?
Yes.
Additional, we say formula funding increase, we're talking about specifically these planning funds that basically help us do our core functions. All right, yeah. So when you go back to cap next year, right, and when you meet with this is going to be an important one because not unlike the SB 375 push that Clint was just describing earlier, there's a bit of a coming together now of a lot of the agencies like ours across the country, like, hey, look, we have to do a lot more things. You just need to compensate us to be able to do that.
Okay, thank you, James. Okay, and then lastly, on the last scenario that we have there, that is the blue line. Again, so this, what we're saying is that what if there is a slight increase in level of funding for ongoing programs from the regional funding round process? In this scenario, we just kind of put in 500,000 in fiscal year 28-29. Obviously, that is something that the board would probably need to have a discussion also too, right? But we just want to kind of show it, say that if we do have a slight increase in the ticket for SACOG, currently at a 1% right now, increase that by 500,000. What does it look like in terms of overall SACOG budgets, right? So with that additional 500,000 increase in fiscal year 28-29, that obviously will help cover the shortfall, and then also, will have a slight impact on the fund balance also. Obviously, there's no guarantee that SACOG will be winning or getting any of that funding, right? But I think with any winning or any combination of it, that will definitely help bridge the gap or the shortfall that we have projected for fiscal year 27-28 and forward. I'm going to pause there for a minute and see if there's any questions on that.
Thank you. Any questions for Loretta at this point? Please, Director Nesbitt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So thank you. I think this is important. You said it's the first time that we've really done this 5-year projection. Couple questions. So the state, obviously the big drop off in the state revenues, some of those 1-time or 2-year cycle grant funding. If you were to go back 5 years prior to this, would the state funding been pretty consistent with what you're projecting in the 3 out years?
Yeah. So I can give a little bit of history on that. So as Loretta mentioned, right, we have the regional funding round, which includes both state and federal funding. One thing that is distinct about that from what you see in the budget charts here is that those dollars don't actually ever hit SACOG's books. And so when the state envisioned the REAP 1 and the REAP 2.0, which is funded Green Means Go, that actually was technically a grant to SACOG. And so it did hit our books. And so we had this huge spike where our budget went from, in the mid-teens to $20 million up to $45 million that you see in the budget slide. So it is a bit of a unique anomaly in terms of how we budget for things.
That's what I figured. And I don't think we can probably expect those numbers to change dramatically given the state, the state's budget the next few years. And then the other question, so I think you just alluded to it, this will help us, I think, in some of our advocacy efforts and understanding where we should be focusing. And then what's the next step for this? Is this coming to the full board of discussion, or is this really just for P&I? I'm curious.
I mean, obviously the full board at some point should get, you are the home committee, right, for budget and operations. And I think we really wanted just to kind of roll this out to you. And I think it's in some ways up to all of you and the incoming chair next year and how you want to pull, you're gonna have quite a few new board members starting next year too. So how do we basically, a little bit open up the budget? So A, people understand it because it's complex. And B, you understand that I think not unlike you have been doing I would say this year in particular, having a full board understanding of this so you can sort of help actually go and advocate for it, right? If you believe that our staff, can be very helpful, let's say, to our local partners and our local jurisdictions, and we're doing good work, right? We then need to get the revenues to be able to, in order to keep doing that, right? So I don't know that we have necessarily a plan for what to do next. We wanted to really start here with you all and get exactly this kind of.
No, I appreciate that. Honestly, I was just curious, but I think, for the full board and certainly for us is to turn this budget forecast into a plan of action for all the board members in terms of the advocacy would be really helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, to the chair.
Please.
Thank you. I just wanted to build off of that. I didn't know where to put this question, but you teed me up because the next item is federal and state advocacy.
Mhm.
So Loretta, you brought up or I think James, you brought up the reauthorization. And so is there a play for us to advocate with other COGs, right? I mean,
Yes.
is anyone in CalCog, has anybody been having these conversations for the formulaic?
So, sure. So I was just at the Association of Metropolitan Planning Organization conference, and you'll hear from our federal advocates, I think, in a few minutes, but they actually represent our national association. So we're in a really great position there. But this issue, as Loretta mentioned, with PL funding, which is what we refer to as the planning funding that we get by formula, as well as the competitive program. So you heard an item from our staff in the past, right, about prioritizing the federal grants that we go after. I think what is unstated there, and certainly we're getting this feedback from when we talk to people at USDOT, is that we maybe made too many competitive programs, which makes their jobs hard, certainly makes your jobs hard. And so how do we look at some of those smaller grant programs and maybe convert those over to formula grants where instead of you all going for Safe Streets for All, for instance, that we have a grant to SACOG for Safe Streets for All, and we put that into our regional funding program, right? So that would be something for SACOG to administer. So those are a couple of the things, but as James mentioned, the current bill expires in 2026. Congress, I don't think, has ever passed a reauthorization on time. So that's why we made some of our assumptions for like 28. But ultimately, they're going to have to answer some of these questions about like what's the right role for MPOs in this process. And we've always had a role, but I think it gets a little bit different now that we've had a trial of what it looks like under the bipartisan infrastructure law.
And I'd say we have, in the last few years, rejoined our National Association of Regional Councils, unfortunately named NARC. I can't not say that.
You'll remember it anyway.
Also the Association of Metropolitan Planning Organizations, right? AMPO, a little better. But we've rejoined both of those in the last, 4 or 5 years?
2 years, yeah.
2
really
years.
pretty good.
So, and, we just were at the AMPO conference. We've been to the NARC conferences. I would also suggest that board members next year, we think a little bit about some of those conferences. They're just really good. You get to be with your peers. I think the NARC conference is in Seattle next summer, but also there's a DC conference, right? Where, so I think we need to get more engaged because this next few years is important, not just for money to come to PL for SACOG, but also how is the federal program work, right? How can we be more competitive? How do we make our voices heard? So that's we're ramping back up into a very active federal policy discussion. And also, so if you know these things, you can advocate, hey, look, we're doing great work in our region. Then it doesn't just take cap to cap. It's when you're meeting with your member of Congress or you're going back with your own, smaller delegation with your city or your county or whoever it may be, you can help make that case. So that's a little bit of what we're trying to do by kind of re-engaging. And the good news is both NARC and AMPO and us all have that kind of up the planning funds, among other policy priorities.
So I think Loretta just has 2 other slides
Yeah.
too.
So,
Go ahead.
just gonna quickly show, just kind of get back to Chair Zaragoza question about fund balance. So as I noted earlier, over the past couple of years, SACOG has been successful in bringing additional funding source into SACOG to supplement the operating costs. So with that, we actually have been accumulated some fund balance and also operating reserve. As you can see from the chart there, obviously as end of fiscal year 23-24, we have over 9.8 million in operating reserve and undesignated fund balance that obviously at the board discretion that can be used to balance the budget or cover any shortfall in any given years. 24, 25 is just an estimate based on what the board approved, the use of the fund balance. And then also just want to mention that we also have the OPEB trust and pension trust that has been established. If any given year that we can potentially use that to kind of smooth out the expenses of the retiree health or unfunded liability. Obviously, that is going to be a last resort that we hope we don't have to go into that, right? So then just lastly, I think James has already kind of mentioned a few of these
Can I-
already. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm
Okay.
sure. So is there a percentage of what that, so I get the raw number, but like I know for like for cities, probably the same for counties, you know, 15% is pretty much what I think best practices for a healthy reserve, or at least what the minimum
Mhm.
healthy is. Are we in that ballpark, or does it not? I know it's not quite apples to apples
Yeah.
because we're a different type of organization, but I'm just trying to get a sense of where we stand from the raw number.
Okay.
I could tag off of that
Sure.
as well. When you start looking at these numbers, when we look at the, say, the 2019, 2020 numbers, these numbers don't look terrible. If we were to compare these numbers to a $45 million number, these numbers are incredibly low. So, but I think that this is more of a traditional type of fund reserve that isn't terribly concerning for me.
Do you use your microphone, please?
Big moving voice.
I know, you
felt like
have
we
that
heard
nice
you.
big voice.
We
so
heard you in
Yeah,
here,
okay.
so we'll try to answer that.
Anyway, I thought, I
No, that's
I
great.
think we're good.
Yeah, so basically on the operating reserve, so we have different type of reserve that's set up. Obviously, the reserve for legal defense, and then there is the operating reserve. So the goal in our policy is to have up to 3 months of operating reserve. So we're not quite there yet. So I think that was one of the things that we were hoping to do in the next budget cycle, to be able to bring back and asking the board authorizations to increase that operating reserve up to three months if we, if there is room available to do that. So,
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, and just briefly on the pension and then OPEB. So we haven't talked a lot about expenditures today, right? But that is something that the previous boards have taken a look at when they've done negotiations with our employees association. Back in 2017, we converted our post-retirement health from a defined benefit to a hybrid plan where we do the minimum that CalPERS requires, and then we add $50 into a monthly account for employees while they're working here, so that they can approximate kind of what they're covering their costs, but reducing the liabilities to SACOG. So we're about 62% funded on the OPEB trust. And then when SACOG sold its interest in this building way back in 2003, we put that into savings. And several years ago, I think in 2019, the board moved that into a pension trust because we really didn't have another purpose for utilizing that. So as unfunded liability costs increase, at times, that is something that the board also has the ability to utilize that to manage those costs so they don't get out of control. We have, just as a brief aside, kind of moved to a majority PEPRA organization, right? We've had a lot of retirements and things. So I think our pension costs we feel are manageable year to year, but certainly we still have unfunded liability payments that are built into that staff budget that you saw on the previous slides.
Philip, are we paying our PERB costs each year, or
We pay up front, so we save a little bit of money, pay in July.
but not anything additional to get
We
past
don't-
the 62%?
we don't make it. Sorry, so 62% is the funded status for post-retirement health. We're, in pools for CalPERS for retirement, and I think we're in the 70 range on our most recent valuations.
67 roughly,
Yeah.
yeah. So we're pretty close. And then that is, and then we have the 2 million pre-funded trust that Eric just mentioned.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Before, any other questions? No, not, I
Yeah,
do
sorry,
have.
one
One-
more.
almost done.
Oh, yeah, one
Almost
more.
done, sorry.
Oh, that,
Okay.
We're,
so
we're
as I-
pausing intentionally.
okay.
Yeah, so as I said, that I think James already kind of mentioned quite a few of these already. So some of the key takeaway for this 5-year forecast that we just did, obviously we see that it's going to be some of the one-time funding, that continuing funding the last MTP SCS projects, for the regions, right? The funding also provides some capacity for SACOG to continue doing technical support in assisting member jurisdiction in writing grants and hopefully get awarded for grants that can continue in funding the projects throughout the regions. And then with the 5-year forecast, obviously just provide a good baseline operating expenses for SACOG. And then based on all the different revenue source, that potential revenue source that I mentioned earlier, definitely that is nothing alarming. And I think this is manageable with the use of reserve funding and, any potential revenues coming in from discretionary grants or increase in formula funding or any combination of that, right? And then, just one thing is that we obviously have to continue pursuing grant opportunities, not only to supplement SACOG operation, but also for the regions, implementing projects for the region also. So that's all I have.
Thank you. Before I open up for public comment, any additional questions? Seeing none, I do have one speaker card, and hopefully I don't butcher the last name. Jeffrey, it looks like Turdgill? Mhm. Okay, thank you. Not yet.
Does that work?
There you go.
Okay, thank you. Um, Jeff Tartagia, as a member of your public, the two questions I will direct at is dealing with combination of the state funding. How much SB1 funding, which is likely to end in this cycle, and how much is coming from other than the, what is it? California Transportation Association in the way of state funding. I didn't see a breakdown of the state funding. I understood much of the federal funding, but I didn't see the breakdown on those levels. That's my question right now to direct to this committee.
Thank you.
Oh, and also pass-through costs versus revenue. The explanation, I see a number through there, but just looking at how that breaks down, please. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you, Mr. Tartagia.
So I can start to address part of that. So just if the committee has interest in the answers to those questions. So SB1, there is a small fixed amount that SACOG gets for planning purposes. It's about $700,000 a year. That isn't going away. So that is a stable source of revenue for us. And then with respect to transit funding, that's SB 125. We have 3 years of funding for that. And so there's a small amount for staff costs that is baked into these assumptions. And again, we're assuming that goes away at the end of that period as well. Most of that is going out to transit agencies as well. So it's works very similar, even though it wasn't highlighted on the federal side. Do you have anything else to add on that?
Yeah, so I just want to add that, obviously that the funding that passed through directly to the transit agency with regards to the SB1 fund is not included in SACOG budget. Same thing with the SB1 fund. So it's not included into the SACOG operating budgets, except the 800,000 that Eric mentioned and a little bit of the administrative fee that we're taking for the administering the SB 125 program.
Thank you. No other public comment, no other speaker cards?
No other public comment.
Thank you. Well, I have to tell you, I have a new appreciation for staff as you go through this. I love having the 5-year forecast, but I especially appreciate taking the pass-through costs out because that is such a dramatic change. And it gives us an actual visual of what our budget we have control over, of what we really are working with. So I think that's really, really helpful. Coming from a school district and from my city, school district, I'm always dependent on the state to see, but I know what my expenses are and I can get a decent idea. As a city, we have a pretty good history on our sales tax and our value of our homes, so we can do that. This is so challenging. because there's such a guesswork piece into this. And certainly elections matter and how that will impact us. So thank you to the staff for a tremendous way to do that.
Chair Iota, one last takeaway, and all the ones that Loretta has provided to you, and really, I think she's done a great job and just hopefully trying to give you a little behind the curtain, here's how this works. You all had a really good discussion on the budget in Woodland, if you remember. And there were a number of questions raised about, why reserve? Like, why are we going to dig into reserves in our budget? And so again, I think Loretta said this morning, but we typically always start a budget cycle, a budget year, saying we're going to use some reserves because we budget conservatively and we don't try to overestimate our revenues, right? And we have done a really nice job, I think, the last few years actually making up for that as we go. And we just closed last fiscal year, right, without use of any reserves. That won't be the case every time, right? But just so you're aware, that's typically our practice is we try to budget conservatively. We don't overestimate revenues. In some ways, we overestimate expenses or the carryover. And so far, anyway, the last few years, we've done pretty well with that, working it back so they don't have to use those reserves.
Well, I
With
think
that,
providing that info is so helpful though, especially when you have a project, when you get the funding is different as when the project's
Right.
happening. So yeah, you may be putting it away this year and then you expend it next year. So it is a tad deceptive if you look, you think, oh, you're digging into your reserves. Well, you'd planned to dig into those reserves. So thank you. And I would suggest, as we know, we're gonna have a lot of new board members. I think it's a fantastic and essential piece to have the budget piece. Give them a little bit of time to get their feet wet, but I think that definitely would be a great inclusive. Thank you so much. All right, we're gonna move on to our next item, and this is our advocacy update, which will go hand in hand with the budget, and Renee DeViroki is our presenter.
All right. Good morning, Renee DeViroki. I'm part of your Legislative and Government Affairs team. So today we actually have a longer presentation from our federal lobbyists. We have a pair, so Capital Transportation Consulting and Pavlicek and Associates. So in advance of November, we wanted to have them give you an overview of kind of the current state of Congress, appropriations, a preview of elections and their impact. And you were just talking about reauthorization. So Devin can go into that a little bit. She joined about 2 or 3 minutes ago, so she didn't hear some of the conversation that you're having, but they're interested in PL and how they can advocate for that. So Devin will present today, and then we'll take a quick pause for some questions, and then we'll have our Chris Lee from Politico Group give an update on what's been happening on the state side. Obviously, from the time the item was written to today, there's September 30th, so there's some updates, and so they'll cover those in live time. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Devin.
It is not letting me share my screen. Hi, everyone. Renee, could you see if they could pull it up on your end? Apologies.
We are checking.
Great. I can talk in the meantime at any point. Hi, I'm Devin Barnhart. Jason Pavlicek and I are your federal advocates in Washington, D.C. And for those of you that are new, the things that we focus on are basically how can we work with our delegation, how can we work with the federal agencies and Congress in general to bring more money and better policy that SACOG supports to the region. And a couple of quick things we just wanted to talk about today, one of which is longer, but I wanted to kick off with sort of what is Congress doing right now and what does that matter? So as all of you know, Congress is almost solely focused on the elections. They have gone home and they are actively campaigning. So sort of everything that's happening in over the past couple of months till now have really been focused on this election period. The one issue that they have been working on that we care a lot about and that we focus on matters like they just passed a funding bill that'll get us through December. That funding bill is the annual appropriations. It funds all the folks that work at the Department of Transportation and every other agency. It also helps support several grants that we care about, including RAISE, Infra, and others, but all of Amtrak's funding comes through that pot, as well as capital infrastructure grants, so the transit capital grants, and then earmarks. And so many of us engage sort of across the region in various earmarks. That is the bill that allows all of those to become law and to get funded. That bill They took a pause. It should have been finished in September, but they almost never get it done that quickly. They basically kicked the can to December. So when they come back after the election, they will jump in on figuring out what that is going to look like. It's a fight right now between the House and the Senate. And so they have to take a look at what happened in the election, know what that's going to mean for the next Congress, and they'll make decisions about, can we get a funding deal together? Sometimes we talk about government shutdowns in Washington, D.C. This is the bill that, if it is not passed, causes a government shutdown. And so some of that conversation may come back after the elections. But barring, usually they all come to a good place. They know that government shutdowns usually mean bad things for both parties. And so they typically all come together in the end and agree to move a bill. But we don't know what that looks like. For those focused on earmarks, generally speaking, if there is an earmark in either bill passed either by the House or the Senate, that typically all gets folded. There is an occasional time when that doesn't happen, but generally speaking, they pick up all the earmarks and those all get passed whenever the larger bill gets resolved. And they're unrelated to like the challenges of the bill. So it's sort of, they're just waiting essentially on the sidelines until folks get the larger deal done. We won't see that until December. So it's a little bit of a quiet time in Congress. If there ever is a quiet time, there's lots happening in the world with FEMA and other things, with some of the major storms. But just in terms of like legislative period, we're in a quiet time because they're all at home getting ready for the next election. So that gives us a little bit of time to start thinking about like, what are we doing for the next Congress? What are we doing for the next administration? How do we get ourselves ready and like ready to execute when everyone comes back and when everything kicks over in January? So I don't know if we've had any luck with the PowerPoint, but
You should be able to add on now your co-host.
oh, great. 1 second. And sorry, Jason's not with us today, but he is unfortunately at a family funeral and couldn't make it.
Hi, Devin. This is Jessica with
Hi.
SafeHub Tech. If
Yeah.
you are having trouble sharing, I can share the PowerPoint for you.
Oh, great. That would be perfect.
Okay.
And if you could just flip us down to slide 10, that would be great. Actually, slide 8. Because yes, I am having difficulties. Give her 1 second. Okay, so what I just talked about was appropriations. That's the annual bill that funds about $10 billion a year. So it's an important bill annually. But the biggest thing that we care about in terms of overall spending and overall policy is on the right-hand side. That's a 5-year reauthorization bill. This is sometimes called the Surface Transportation Law. In the last bill, it was both called IIJA, it was called BIL or bill. In the past, they've had various names: Safety Lou, FAST Act, MAP 21. Basically, it's the bill that provides all the funding for MPOs from the federal side, state DOTs, it's their entire highway program. It's a fair portion of transit funding. Traditionally has been a small amount of rail funding, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And it is the major driver of policy change. And so when we're thinking about transportation, this is the bill we are usually targeting. We can tweak it in that annual appropriations bill. We can support grants that are important to us, but the bulk of the work happens on this 5-year bill. And the last bill expires in 2026. And so even though 2026 feels a way away, Congress takes a really long time to move things through the process. And there's a lot of players in this space. So we have to actually get started now. If you could switch down to the next slide. And one more. This is just a very fast history for those of you that haven't been a part of it, but we established the federal highway system back in 1916. That's when the government decided like we should be federally supporting that. We have passed a number of bills since then. The most recent is this IIJA. That was a huge infrastructure spending bill. But you can see that was back in 2021. So we're just about ready to flip over into the next bill. And we've been seeing a lot of that money go out the door from the last bill from IIJA. Many things that SACOG has applied for, but that funding, because of how long it took to get set up, will last us longer than 2026. We'll probably still see some of that funding in 2027 and 2028, but they're really trying to wrap up that money and get it out the door as quickly as possible, which means that this next bill has to be ready to sort of step in and move that funding forward. You can go to the next slide. Okay, I just laid out some key questions to talk about. What does this mean for us? What do the elections impact? And so I'm just going to run through these questions. We are in a pretty strange time. For most of the transportation periods, we've had long-standing senior members of Congress who had done transportation for decades in some cases be at the helm of leading the next transportation bill. But this year we have had sort of over the course of the past couple of years, we've had a number of retirements. There are some requirements in Congress about how long you can be a chair on the Republican side. And so we're actually seeing this really new, fresh window of folks coming in that don't have the baked in history of everything that has happened in Congress. And so it's also happening at a staff level. So some of the staff that had been there for decades that sort of held the line on what is federal, like what gets federal support, what doesn't, that's turning over a bit. There's a couple of long-term staffers that are staying, but for the most part, it's almost like 80% new folks. And so it puts a big question mark for us, both how much of like what was old will they believe is still true? And then also, how far can we push the envelope with a set of new folks with new thinking around what surface transportation is? So if you could go to the next slide, you'll just see my general, like, we don't know what's going to happen. It's a little bit of a question mark around what happens both with the elections in terms of like who's in charge of the House and Senate, who gets to be chair of the various committees that handle transportation, but also we know that there's just going to be this layer of new folks that require a bunch of education. Some of that we're already doing. James was just out in DC meeting with some of our delegation members and some members that are on the T&I committee that care a lot about regional policy. And so we're starting that education piece, and we're sort of always in that education phase, but now we're getting ready to flip into like what our real advocacy will be. Another question that we're going to face, the last bill was a very unique special bill. They frequently called it a once in a generation bill. So we don't know if Congress will decide that they are now in a once in a generation space and that they're going to keep funding sort of like these gigantic, massive infrastructure bills. But if you can flip to the next slide, that like aqua blue color on the right, that's pretty much our traditional transportation funding with a little bit of aviation thrown in there. But for the most part, that's the world that we fund every 5 years. It gives us highway money, rail money, transit money, et cetera, and all of our planning money, including PL. But with the last bill, they added the entire, I don't know if it's your left-hand side, but the purple and dark blue colors. All of those were new FEMA funding, electricity, broadband, et cetera. And so we don't know if Congress is going to come back in and say, that was great for us. Our communities got a lot out of that, and we need to continue to fund these like massive, big bills across both transportation and other types of infrastructure, or if we'll turn to the more traditional surface transportation bill. A betting person in DC will say like this Congress probably isn't going to want to spend a lot of money and is going to return to that traditional space, but people would have guessed that before the last bill as well. So it's a little bit up in the air. Okay, next slide. Same question related to, well, what does that mean for how much is going to exist? The baseline matters because that's what we use to plan. And so because this is a 5-year bill, we know we'll get 5 years of funding. We can look out through that window and start aligning our projects with how much money we're going to have coming in. But the baseline is also in question. Could you flip to the next? Okay, it says current, but the FAST Act, this was the last bill before bipartisan infrastructure law, before IIJA. That's traditionally what we would have spent. The aqua on the bottom is highway, so bulk of the funding goes to highways. Some of that is suballocated to MPOs. A portion of the funding goes to transit, and then a very, very small amount goes to rail and intermodal in general. Bipartisan infrastructure law on the right-hand side, the IIJA, that really transitioned us into a new space. They added increased funding for everyone in the pot, but huge increases, almost doubling for transit and rail. Really unusual because there's been these long-term fights about if our money is coming from the Highway Trust Fund, which is funded by the gas tax, from when folks fuel up their vehicles, then most of the money should return to the highways. That's been the traditional thinking. But as those highway trust funds have gone away, as the amount of money in the highway trust fund has gone away because our cars have gotten more fuel efficient, more and more money has come from general transfers. And in this last bill in particular, a huge portion of the money came from general transfers. So that means, in theory, that we should be funding sort of all the world of surface transportation a bit more equitably. So we don't know whether Congress is going to say, we like what we did in IIJA, we're happy to figure out a way to pay for sort of all of these modes of transportation, or if they'll revert to the one that says FAST Act, which is a more like highway-driven model. And I think just for guessing purposes, you can guess that we're probably going to be in between these two numbers. I would say it's unlikely that we reach IIJA levels again, but stranger things have happened. So we're also like in this bit of a question mark about what this Congress does with what our new baseline is. Okay, next slide. Discretionary versus formula versus no funding. Jason added this slide about no funding. Can you go to the next slide? It might be easier to explain. Yeah. Traditional funding from the federal government down to regions and locals basically goes that we set a formula based on population and a bunch of other requirements, various metrics, and each state gets their portion. And then some portion of that goes to the region, goes to SACOG and other MPOs. And it's a pretty seamless process. So that amount of money gets set, that money flows out the door. And sort of like everyone trickles down to get their correct pot of money and then spends it based on their program. I flip to the next one. What the last bill did was try to open up the availability of federal funding to everyone. And so instead of states being the main recipient of funding and then regions getting sort of like the next, instead, what they said is like, we should have a bunch of new programs and everyone should essentially have access to many of these programs. And so for the first time ever, small towns that had never seen a federal transportation dollar could apply for pretty large scale grants and get access to that money. The difference here is that it requires long application periods. So everyone has to fill out these sort of very expansive and expensive applications, and then DOT picks the winner. So it's not like seamless process. It's sort of a long application and selection process, and then the money flows out the door. It has created some challenges for lots of folks, including how many times we have to apply for grant, how much money is spent on grant applications, staffing. For the first time, many communities are getting grants. They've never had a federal dollar, which means they may not see the worldview on how difficult it is to spend a federal dollar. There's a lot of paperwork associated with that money. And so everyone's sort of having this big reset period. If you could flip over another slide. And then I'm just going to slide through these real quick. Could you flip through the next? I think it's one or two. Okay, I think it's just those two. All right, back up one. These slides are just to show you that we created like 10 to 20 new grants. We created a lot of grants in the last bill that hadn't previously existed. And so a large portion of the funding went from flowing right sort of down the line, but being state driven, to now being open to everyone. And it makes it difficult to know sort of like, know how that money is going to come, plan for that money, have a long-term understanding of what you do in the region. And also all of these NOFOs for all these various programs are opening at different times, closing at different times. And so it can just make things challenging, but it also opened up this huge opportunity at the local level and regional level to be able to access much larger pots of money. And so Congress is going to enter this debate where they say, like, do we need all of these programs? Is this tenable? And I think a lot of folks are going to say, no, we don't. This was probably too many. Some of these could be transitioned to a formula program. If you go back one slide, I think the most frequently identified program that could be transitioned to formula would be Safe Streets. Safe Streets is really about providing funding to protect all road users, including vulnerable road users, those that are walking and biking. That program has $5 billion. And so there's a push amongst some of the associations in Washington, D.C. to turn that into a formula program so that both states and MPOs could better support those projects, rather than having every single community in the country try to apply for that money. Some of these others, folks have supported, they do have a lot of backing, but you can anticipate that some of them might get folded into each other, might go away entirely under a new administration, depending on who's in charge, or may just remain as grants, but maybe not at the level that they're currently at. Okay, and if you could flip ahead.
Hey, Devin, sorry, can you stay on that slide? I just want to do one thing for the board because we had a very good discussion, the last item about advocacy and coming up next year. So maybe these acronyms are familiar to you. On the top left, RAISE, that's what's funded our mobility zones work. So we got a $5 million grant for that. Safe Streets, we helped Yuba Sutter get a Safe Streets grant, and many more have come into the region. Bottom right, Reconnecting Communities is what we've got for the Green Means Go, when we had 10 of our jurisdictions all kind of band together. And bottom left, Protect grants. If you were up in the Placerville, El Dorado County briefing, we're trying to get some Protect climate adaptation, disaster preparedness for things like Trip to Green. So I just wanted to kind of bring those. Yes, there's too many, but also we have done fairly well in actually getting some of these key federal grants. So I just want to connect them back to things you know. Okay.
Great. Just flagging on these grants, my commentary on are there too many, are there too little, isn't necessarily driven by sort of like our own personal opinions. It's really just the conversation around policy that's happening at DC. And I'd say most of the associations are starting to say like it's too many. And so there will be some conversation around consolidation. And we just want to make sure that the ones that work best for the regions, for SACOG, are the ones that continue to be funded in the right way, in the way that works best for us. Okay, if you could flip forward. All right, and then the last question, and then flip forward one more is, why can't we be friends? Okay, this slide just goes to show transportation seems like it should be pretty easy to have a conversation about, because how many committees can actually work on transportation in Congress? And you probably know this from the state side as well, but in Washington, D.C., it's a lot of committees. Traditionally, the main committees, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee on the House side, and EPW, the Environment and Public Works Committee on the Senate side, for the most part, have passed bipartisan bills. And then those sort of sail through Congress and everyone else attaches. So transit comes in from banking and rail comes in from commerce, et cetera. Finance piece for how we pay for it and the Ways and Means piece for how we pay for it on the House side, they all come in. That has been the model we have seen throughout most of the bills. There's always hiccups. There have been hiccups where people have tried to delete transit entirely and then their bill doesn't move forward, et cetera. But generally speaking, transportation tends to be very bipartisan. This last bill, however, was very strange, and we just don't know if Congress is going to look to that model again. In the last bill, some of the committees acted in a bipartisan manner. And then a group of 10 to 20 senators came together and were essentially decided that they could do their own bipartisan infrastructure, which is why we call it the bipartisan infrastructure law. They could form their own bill. And they set the policy. So these committees had some say in it, but they were not the driver of the policy. And it made for sort of interesting new policies and programs getting funded that had never been funded before. Just a prime example, rail. So all of Amtrak, freight rail, et cetera, usually gets about $2 billion to $3 billion a year, suddenly had $66 billion. So there were sort of these like wild swings in policy and funding over a 5-year bill that we hadn't seen before, and we just don't know whether those will be continued and whether, depending on the outcomes of the elections, folks are going to continue in this bipartisan manner that they previously had. We have seen a lot, if we're just like looking at very recent history, there's a lot of trouble being bipartisan. And if the margins get tighter, you could see like an even trickier situation. So anyhow, this is something that we're watching. And then I think, is that my last slide? Did I put one more in? Oh, yes, perfect. This is, okay, so what does all of that mean for us? we have been through this many times, James included, has seen many a surface transportation bill through its variety of iterations, through all sorts of parties, being in charge and through very tight margins. And so we sort of have a game plan generally, right? Like we know the things that we need to push for, more funding for regions as regions have taken on more and more activities, and there's more happening in the world, particularly around resilience and other issues. More funding is needed at the regional level, more PL funding in particular. We're also thinking about like what kinds of new programs can support the work that we're doing. And we're always sort of underlacing all of that with our work around Green Means Go and how we can get more federal support for that kind of activity. And so this bill is really critical for us. Jason and I, working with the SACOG staff, basically are saying, okay, what are all our priorities? And then what Jason and I do is sort of look at the landscape post-election. Who's in charge where might it make sense to try and push something? Where is it going to be really challenging? Where can the administration support depending on who wins that election? And so we sort of carve out how we get to the wins by working through what we see happens after November. And so this bill will probably take 18 months to 2 years. You'll hear us talking about it a lot. So I would consider this like a primer of like what's the big picture view. And then sort of as we work our way through our priorities and what we see after the election, we'll be much more specific about what that means long term and how we sort of see those playing out strategically. Any questions or concerns, thoughts, feelings? Welcome it all.
Thank you. Open up for questions. Director Soon.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Devin, for that presentation. That's great insight into that whole process. Just a little bit more of a nuance in terms of the strategy. So we were in the last item, if you heard, we were talking about the need for increasing formulaic funding through some of these grant programs. In terms of strategy, I know you have to wait till November and all that, but can you go into what the strategy would be? Is it aligning ourselves with, other areas and, nationally, that kind of thing? It just seems daunting to me, but I wanted to see what your take is.
I would say Congress right now is daunting. That's a fair place to start. But the couple of things that we're doing right now is one, making sure that some of the key organizations are all aligned in their messaging around increased PL funding. So for example, AMPO just had their conference. NARCS, I think NARC, which represents the regional councils, is early next year, really building that base so that it's not just one voice suggesting that this is an important next step, but that it's literally as many voices as we can get, pushing on all parts. When individual MPOs or regions come to talk to their members of Congress, it's not inherently a party issue, right? So figuring out what are the best messages for them to hear. We really think we need to stop calling it PL funding, just generally. People don't know what that means, and talk about what do those planning funds actually do, so that the purpose of the funds resonate more than necessarily the title. I feel like sometimes people just sort of lose the stream. And so anyhow, we're really trying to focus on like, how do we talk about these in a very meaningful way? It's something we all have a lot. I mean, you all know at your level that is something that has to happen anyhow, because the projects that we all work on have these immense and beneficial outcomes. But when we talk about like how we get there, we lose folks. So anyhow, we're doing that big piece, trying to collect as many stories about how that can support folks. So it is daunting, but Congress is going to pass this bill. They have to do it in order to continue the trust fund. They don't have to do it quickly, but they will do it essentially over the course of the next 2 to 3 years. And so it's a matter of making sure that we are working in that right direction, and that we're also, it's the best way to put it, make sure we're not at odds with some of the other key organizations that Congress likes to listen to. So one of the important ones is AASHTO. That is the association that represents state DOTs. They play a sort of outsized role in the funding because of how the funding has traditionally been mostly highway focused. So making sure that our state partners are also engaged in our priorities is really important. They have their own obvious priorities, but at times they have been detractors
Wow.
from the important role
Yeah.
that we play. And so where we have folks that are good actors, there are many, many states that are good actors in this space, making sure that we are on their list as well. It doesn't have to be at the top, but like making sure that they are helping to bolster that message is really important. So those are some of the tactics. And as we know who's in charge and how much their sort of regions matter, we map that out. And so just for example, if we know that a certain state is going to have a member of Congress that's really important, we try to align our priorities with them and see like where can we bolster our message. So there's lots of different tactics to use once we know who the players are. But it'll be interesting. Jason and I'll have a busy November, and we'll happily share those thoughts.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's very helpful. And James already mentioned, and Eric, that they've already been working at some of the organizations level. I think the AASHTO one is that's very good to know as well. And so it's good news for us as a board to know where we should help out in the coming months.
Just one other thing to maybe add to the primer. So Devin brought up AASHTO, right? I think one thing that's important to know when you're going to DC from California is California and MPOs have a very different relationship than many other states, where the DOT takes a very strong hand, in some ways puts the people on the MPO board and basically tells the MPO board what to do. So in many ways, we actually have an opportunity to go back and say, there's a better way things could be done, right? And talk about some of the many things we are doing are actually unique. There are other states that have good MPOs that are models as well, but it's our story, right? That is kind of where we want Congress to see the vision for what MPOs could really be doing across the country and why it's important to invest those funds.
Thank you.
In some states, the governor actually appoints the members of the MPO, just imagine. You don't know how good you have it.
Anything additional, Renee, or any other questions?
If not, I'll have Chris come join us.
All right. Sorry, back there. I figured you had something to add to this conversation.
Good morning, Chair and Directors. Chris Lee with Politico Group. I'll have a very brief presentation today. Get my chair.
A very short presentation.
Okay, well, I'm just gonna sit here like this. We spent a lot of time over the last few meetings talking about AB 350. Just wanted to add one brief update to the conversation that you had earlier, which is on the SB1 eligibility question. Our firm works very closely with a lot of statewide organizations, including CalCog, and I can say with increasing confidence that there will be a coalition of statewide groups that will be pushing for that restoration of APS eligibility in the SB1 programs next year. So as James mentioned, in addition to the effort with the MPOs on the SB 375 and how that works, I think there will also be an effort underfoot for SACOG to be able to support on the SB1 eligibility question. So that's good news. I'm gonna briefly, okay. Going to briefly cover three things this morning. First, the second extraordinary session of the legislature is underway with the Senate convening today. Give you a little brief update on the completion of the governor's signings and vetoes that were just done as of September 30th, and then finally talk a little bit about the statewide election ballot. So first on the special session, as everyone knows from the report and from the media coverage on it, the governor had a proposal that was essentially designed at ensuring that fuel refineries maintain stocks of transportation fuels, gasoline, to avert when there are shutdowns and maintenance price spikes related to fuel supplies. And so that bill was introduced in the regular session as SB 950 by Senator Skinner. And then it was kind of part of a broader energy affordability package where most of the bills in that package ended up not progressing and not going through the full process to the governor's desk. So almost immediately after the failure of that package, the governor called the legislature into the second extraordinary session for this two-year session. The assembly convened immediately. I think that was the last night of the regular session. The Senate said, we're not going to do that. We were ready to pass SB 950 and other bills in the energy package. And so took a pretty strident position there initially. That subsequently softened during the signing period. Senator McGuire, the pro tem of the Senate, said that the Senate would come into session if the Assembly sent them bills. That has now happened. The Assembly passed 2 bills, I believe, yes, last week. AB X21, which was basically a reintroduction of that SB 950 Skinner vehicle about maintaining adequate supplies of transportation fuels and providing additional state oversight over that. They also passed AB X22, which required basically 2 reports. The first was for CARB to complete its so-called multimedia evaluation of increasing the ethanol content in gasoline, with the idea being that could help avert price spikes. Other states allow up to 15% ethanol. California only allows 10%. The contents of that study is really looking at the emissions, the air quality, the waste byproducts, the water impacts. The media that they're talking about is air, soil, water. So that bill gave CARB a directive to come back with that report by July 1, 2025. They also asked the California Energy Commission to come back with, by the same date, with additional recommendations for the legislature coming out of the 2024 Transportation Fuels Assessment. That's actually the document that included a bunch of different approaches to how do we get gasoline prices down, basically. What are all the different inputs and policies that we could do? And that was actually the genesis of SB 950, now AB X21. So those bills were both passed. The governor's proposal essentially was passed by a pretty narrow vote. There were probably some add-ons since I wrote this, but it was 44 votes on the floor out of 80. No Republicans voting yes, 2 Democrats voting no, several abstentions. And then the reporting bill on the ethanol and on the Energy Commission recommendations passed with bipartisan support. So the Senate has now made good on their word. They've convened for special session as of today. They're planning a hearing this afternoon in the policy committee. It's interesting, however, they're only taking up AB X21, which is basically the governor's proposal. The other bill is not in the file. And so they have a floor session scheduled for later in the week. Anticipate that that could pass and we could probably see the special session wrap up. So that's just a brief coverage of that. There were a lot of proposals that were introduced by the minority party that would have had some pretty serious implications for transportation funding programs, depending on how they were implemented. None of those bills are advancing. And so likely to see that all wrap up this week if the Senate passes the bill and sends it to the governor. Signings and vetoes, all the bills that we highlighted for you in the report were ultimately signed. I think, the housing bills, not a lot of surprises there. I think the biggest surprises were in some of the vetoes that were not highlighted for you. There was some proposals related to adaptive reuse and streamlining that included some new asks from basically both the carpenters and folks in the building trades that some folks in the housing community were very concerned about. Also during the special session, a lot of folks in the building trades were expressing a lot of concerns about the proposal that the governor was advancing related to the refineries and storage of fuels. And so I think a lot of folks are reading into the political side of that as well. There was a bill that was double joined with a bill to provide ongoing state affordable housing tax credits. The federal tax credits are the single biggest source of affordable housing funding in California. The bill that was double joined with that additional ongoing $500 million year allocation would have required that those tax credits, when they're allocated by the committee, it's called the Tax Credit Allocation Committee, would constitute subsidy, a public subsidy, and require payment of prevailing wage. So this was, universally supported by labor. The governor signed that bill, but he did not sign the ongoing authorization for the $500 million a year in state affordable housing tax credits. So that bill does not become law. So he had a signing statement saying he supports improved labor standards for folks who are building affordable housing, but he did not sign the bill for budgetary reasons to provide that ongoing state affordable housing tax credit. The other piece that was pretty controversial in the Haney bill related to adaptive reuse I mentioned was a new provision related to enforcing a lot of the labor standards that are going into these housing bills. So there was basically these stop work provisions that affordable housing developers were very concerned about. And so that bill was vetoed. But as you see in the report, there was 32 housing bills that were signed all at once, big press conference, a lot of talk about enforcement and accountability. The governor had another press conference last week where he was announcing encampment resolution funding grants and a new, presumably a contract term, because I don't see it in the law. It could be trailer bill next year. I'm not sure what form it will take. But basically, the governor's now saying that for a lot of these homelessness and housing grants, they're going to have requirements that if local agencies subsequently come out of compliance with housing element or other state housing laws, that the state would have the ability to claw back the funding. So not a lot of details, which unfortunately is kind of consistent with how this administration operates. We do the press first and then we see the details later. But we'll be monitoring that. I'm not sure if there will be a direct impact to any programs that SACOG is involved with, but as local government officials, something you should all be aware of. And then I'll just talk really briefly and then see if there are any questions. I included a rundown of the legislative delegation races in the SACOG region. I'm sure you're all a lot more familiar with that than I am. Fun update, I ran into Christopher Gabaldon in the grocery store last week and told him that we were very excited to work with him if he were indeed elected to the state senate, which I think odds are pretty good. You know, a lot of turnover in the Sacramento region with Kevin McCarty running for mayor. Bill Dodd, who's been very helpful on SACOG priorities and priorities of other clients that we work with, terming out, and excited that someone who has, I think, a really strong focus on issues that are important to SACOG in Christopher Gabaldon. Looking forward to a partner there. And then we were also excited to see that Maggie Krell made an appearance at the Green Means Go convening a few weeks ago, where we talked about the work that's being done with REAP 2. Just to add on a little bit to the polling on the ballot measures, there hasn't been a lot of public polling that I've seen. I thought this Proposition 5 result here in the PPIC poll was pretty promising. 49% saying they would vote yes and 50% saying they would vote no. Again, this is the measure that would reduce the voter approval requirement for affordable housing and public infrastructure bonds only. Sales taxes came out in the final weeks of the legislative session. The USC poll that came out a few weeks ago after this one was much more consistent with prior polling that I'd seen on reduced voter approval. That poll showed that only 43.3% of respondents would vote yes, with 35.2% voting no. So we will see. That's been a longstanding priority of Majority Leader Aguilar Curry. Always was going to be a tough lift, but that's one that we'll watch closely. So that's all I have for you today. Happy to answer any questions that you might have. But again, we're looking forward to seeing the results of the election and changes to leadership and committee that will really shape next year's priorities and how we approach the legislature on these things.
Thank you so much. I always love the delivery. Any questions? Any updates? All right. Any public comment cards on this item?
There are no public comments on this item.
All right, thank you. And welcome to Director Thomas. I see you up there. So we did recognize you where you joined us.
Well, I apologize that there were challenges with the Zoom link, so I'm sorry I was late. Thank you.
No problem. All right, well, that was our last information item. We do have a receive and file item, which is really great information if you get an opportunity to look at the Mega Region Working Group. And other than that, anything else for the good of the order? Any announcements?
Chair Gallardo, just a reminder, the board meeting on the 17th will begin at 9 a.m. So trying to keep that so that you guys can get out of there in time. There'll be some really good items on the agenda. The Transportation Committee just adopted the regional funding round guidelines and also the recommended priorities for federal and state grants that you were just kind of connected to what you're talking about earlier. And the workshop is going to be around street safety and the sort of alarming uptick in pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities on streets. The Sacramento region just ticked into the top 20 most dangerous in the United States for bicycle and pedestrian injuries. And if you followed what's happening in the city of Sacramento and elsewhere, that is certainly catching a lot of headlines, sadly, unfortunately. So, but also the line there in terms of the disparate impact on people who are in those numbers by race, ethnicity, by income, by location, and by type of street. So stay tuned for that. Should be a very informative workshop. That's it.
I know we're working on it with us and all of a sudden at our schools with the proliferation of e-bikes and scooters and what isn't actually an e-bike, but is more of a motorized. Yeah, these kids learn quickly how to get around those governors. Yeah, so I think it's great timing because I think we're all
Actually,
gonna
as you were
experience- I know
talking about,
You guys are doing that grant. You're gonna see the same. We had 3 accidents just as school started.
Oh,
3
wow.
kids that were hit.
I meant to say, you were talking about a lot about federal policy this morning, the cap to cap trip. I just want to flag that for you all. Many of you go on it, the Metro Chamber. I know the Placer Business Alliance is going back in November, actually right over our board meeting. So I normally would love to go to those trips. But the cap to cap trip next year is going to be May, roughly 3rd to the 7th. And if you haven't been on that, it's a really great trip. And just timing wise, given everything we just talked about, good to put on your calendar.
Thank you so much. Well, believe it or not, our next meeting is going to be on December 2nd. Does that sound, hopefully it won't be 100 degrees outside. So perhaps by then we'll get fall.